The deadline is Friday. You finished on Tuesday, not because you had extra time, not because the task was easy, but because something in you couldn't leave it sitting there, unfinished, with days still on the clock. While everyone else was still getting started, you were already done, and quietly wondering how they can live any other way. Most people treat deadlines as the finish line. You treat them as the latest possible moment something could go wrong. There's a difference between those two things, and maybe you've noticed it your whole life. In classrooms, in workplaces, in every situation where a due date was involved. The deadline isn't when you finish, it's just when you stop having time to fix things, if something breaks. People sometimes call this anxious, or rigid, or read it as an inability to relax. But if that framing ever felt off to you, it probably should. Because what's actually happening might have less to do with anxiety and more to do with a very specific way of thinking about time and about what it means to be prepared. Let's start with something you might recognize. When you have an unfinished task in front of you, it doesn't really stay in front of you. It follows you into conversations you're trying to have, into evenings you're trying to enjoy, into that quiet moment before sleep, when your brain decides to run an inventory of everything that isn't done yet. Finishing early isn't just about the task, it's about getting your mind back. Psychologists sometimes describe this as the Zeigarnik effect, the brain's tendency to keep unfinished tasks active in working memory until they're resolved. Research in cognitive psychology suggests that incomplete tasks create a kind of low-level mental noise that runs in the background, whether you want it to or not. For some people, that noise is barely noticeable. For others, it's loud enough to make everything else harder. If you're someone who never leaves things to the last minute, you might be someone who hears that noise more clearly than most. Not because something is wrong with you, but because your brain takes commitments seriously, and unfinished commitments feel like open loops that want to be closed. There's also something worth noticing about control. Last-minute completion puts a lot of variables outside your hands. Traffic, technology, unexpected interruptions. The thing that was supposed to take an hour, taking 3. People who finish early aren't eliminating those variables. They're just making sure those variables can't decide the outcome for them. That's not rigidity, that's contingency thinking. Research on conscientiousness, one of the most studied personality traits, consistently finds that people who score high on this trait tend to plan ahead, meet commitments early, and feel genuine discomfort when things are left unresolved. It's one of the most reliable predictors of long-term success across nearly every domain studied. Not because these people work harder necessarily, but because they build systems that don't depend on everything going right at the last second. Maybe you've always been this way. Or maybe you can point to a moment, a missed deadline, a scramble that didn't have to happen, a situation where waiting cost more than it should have, where you decided, quietly, that you weren't going to put yourself in that position again. Either way, the pattern tends to stick, and once it's there, cutting it close starts to feel genuinely uncomfortable, in a way that's hard to explain to someone who doesn't feel it. Here's something that doesn't get said enough about this. Finishing early is a form of respect for other people and for yourself. When you submit something before it's due, when you show up prepared, when you don't make other people wait on you because you ran out of time, you're making a statement about how seriously you take your commitments. That statement lands even when no one says anything about it. The people around you notice. Maybe not in the moment, but over time, a reputation builds. And the reputation of someone who always comes through before the pressure hits is one of the most quietly valuable things a person can have in any professional or personal relationship. Think about what last minute actually looks like from the outside. The scramble, the slightly unfinished edges, the energy of someone who is finishing something while also presenting it. Most people are polite enough not to say anything. But there's a difference between work done under pressure and work done with room to breathe. And that difference usually shows up somewhere, even in small ways. You probably already know this. It might be part of why you can't quite bring yourself to wait until the last moment, even when technically you could. Now here's where it goes a little deeper, because this isn't just about tasks and deadlines. For a lot of people who carry this trait, it extends into almost everything. Packing for a trip the night before instead of the morning of, knowing where your keys are before you need them, having a plan for the plan, a backup route, a contingency, a quiet awareness of what happens if the first option doesn't work. It can look like over-preparation to people who don't think this way, and maybe sometimes it is. But there's a kind of peace that comes from being ready, a specific calm that's hard to access any other way. The calm of knowing that if something goes sideways, you have room to maneuver. that you're not one unexpected delay away from everything falling apart. Studies on stress and preparation suggest that anticipatory planning, thinking through potential obstacles before they happen, significantly reduces anxiety in high-stakes situations. People who prepare early don't just perform better under pressure. They experience less pressure to begin with because they've already done the work of imagining what could go wrong and building in time to handle it. That's not worrying, that's engineering. But there's a shadow side worth sitting with for a moment, not to criticize, just to see it clearly. Sometimes the drive to finish early can make it hard to be present in the time before something is due. You finish the project on Tuesday, but you spend Wednesday and Thursday half wondering if you should have done something differently. The task is done, but the mental loop hasn't quite closed. And sometimes the standard you hold yourself to, the level of preparation you expect, can be hard to turn off, even when the stakes don't really require it. A low-stakes email gets the same treatment as a high-stakes presentation. A casual plan gets the same level of contingency thinking as a critical deadline. The engine runs at full capacity, even when full capacity isn't what the situation needs. That's worth noticing, not because the trait is wrong, but because knowing when to apply it fully and when to let it idle a little, that's its own kind of skill. The people who never leave things to the last minute understand something that's easy to miss when you're moving fast. That time is not just a resource, it's a buffer. And buffers are what make the difference between a small problem and a real one, between a rough draft and a finished one, between showing up ready and showing up hoping. In a world that increasingly celebrates the last-minute pivot, the done-at-midnight submission, the I work better under pressure badge of honor, there's something worth recognizing about a person who quietly does the work before the pressure arrives, who doesn't need the deadline to motivate them, who builds in the margin not because they're afraid, but because they understand what margins are actually for. That's not a small thing. That's a way of moving through the world that most people have to learn the hard way, if they learn it at all. Are you someone who finishes early and can't quite understand how others wait until the last minute? Or do you think the pressure of a deadline actually brings out something useful? Let me know, because I think more people quietly live by this than would ever describe themselves as planners. To get more psychology content like this in your feed, please subscribe, hit the like button, and share your experiences with us. You'll be supporting our efforts too. Thanks for watching.